so welcome back to the already third day of our wonderful so far meeting. I'm sure you're all pleased by all the information, all the experiences you've been through so far. So this afternoon, this session is going to be comprised by 3 lectures. The first one by a well-known French scholar at the CEALEX, Aude Simonie. She's an expert in local pottery, by local I mean Alexandrian pottery, say the least. And then she will be followed by Aya Salem, an osteologist in the Department of Alexandrian Inspectorate. And then the whole thing will be wrapped up by the speaker. So with no further ado, let me just call to the podium Aude. She's going to be talking to us about pottery from the Podium Sadby necropolis in Alexandria.
So first, I would like to thank all the organization team for inviting me to present this work about the Hypogeum C of Sadby necropolis at this really interesting workshop. So the eastern necropolis of Sadby was first excavated between 1904 and 1910 by Evaristo Breccia, then the director of the Greco-Roman Museum of Alexandria. His work was helping to confirm that this area was one of the earliest cemeteries of the city founded by Alexander the Great, going back to the 4th century BC. The first burial generally took form of individual shaft tomb, but in addition, 2 subterranean complex hypogea with a great number of loculi grave have been discovered. The bigger one, Hypogeum A, has been fully documented in Breccia's publication of 1912. A smaller one, the tomb B, was only cleared, but fully documented. And a third one, Hypogeum C, remained unstudied. In 2010, the Commission for Research of Ancient Urbanity at the Bavarian Academy of Science and Humanity decided to start a new project in order to reinvestigate the Hellenistic necropolis of Sadby, aiming at filling some gaps in the documentation, such as precising the chronology of this necropolis. The first working season of 2010 was led by Stefan Schmidt and Christoph Römmel and has been dedicated to the reinvestigation of Hypogeum B, whereas the campaign of 2012 and 2013 included the excavation of the last unstudied underground tomb, this one, the C, and also the topographic survey of the entire necropolis. At least the campaign of 2014, in which I took part, was dedicated to the study of the archaeological material. The results have then been published in 2020 in a full volume. So this Hypogeum C is located on the western part of Hypogeum A and southwest of Hypogeum B. It could be identified as a shallow dip, marking the outline of the central courtyard and the entrance to the access to the stairwell. These elements were already appearing in the early 20th century on Breccia's maps of the site. The work then started with the clearing of the sandy layer and modern refuse, and around 180 centimeters above the sea level, intact filling layer that you can see here have been reached. So the slope of this layer is following an orientation from the west to the east, indicating a gradual infill of sand. Also, some large sandstone block remaining of the perimeter of the wall on the top of the hypogeum, probably corresponding to the level documented by Breccia in the early 20th century, were visible. Between 180 centimeter and 70 centimeter above the sea level, the filling is suggesting that the open pit created by the shaft was used as a rubbish dump. Then we have some clue of some reoccupation of the courtyard, because a small niche was cut into the western part of the northern face of the courtyard. Some observations were also made on the stairwell of the courtyard, showing that the stone have not been smoothed and are still showing some traces of tool mark. And two doorways leading off from the central courtyard have never been completed. So that was a proof that this hypogeum C has never been completed and was then abandoned. At a level of 70 centimeters above the sea level, in the shaft and in the stairwell, a large amount of pottery were showing a reuse or a reoccupation of the tomb. Some horizontally stone have been placed inside the stairwell and in the southeastern corner of the courtyard. Beneath this artificial habitation, a thick, homogeneous, clean layer of sand has been found. This clearly shows that for a period after this initial abandonment, the tomb was then totally abandoned. The lowest layer in the shaft was then reached, and it was containing some small stone fragment as a result of the construction process of the complex. Then, due to the rise of the groundwater level, the excavation couldn't be completed at this stage. So the result of this excavation were suggesting different phases of occupation of the tomb. The first phase consists in the construction of this funerary complex, quarried in the sandstone bedrock. It seems like this construction was abandoned in mid-process. Then the second phase, during the second phase, the complex was obviously abandoned, and the open shaft, the courtyard, was gradually filled with sand. During the third phase, a temporary shelter in the stairwell was made. So we are in a new phase of reoccupation, in the first phase of reoccupation in the tomb. Then the complex is filling with sand again and is used as a refuse dump. During the phase 5, the complex is reoccupied and a niche is cut in the northern face of the shaft. And then the shaft is used as a refuse dump again. So the work carried by the Bavarian Academy of Science at Chadby Necropolis had then shown that this last unstudied underground burial complex has never been completed, and the material, especially the pottery, could then help in providing a date for the final abandonment of this area of the necropolis. Already, it seems clear that this area was gradually filled with windblown sand, and has been reused repeatedly as a shelter or for burial purpose. So let's go now to the pottery part. So all the material that has been discovered in the backfill layer of the structure, that is more likely corresponding to progressive filling over time. Therefore, the aim of this study was trying to understand the history of this filling and the successive reoccupation. The ceramic objects have been recorded during the excavation according to the depths of the successive level. So we have, for example, L1, which is the upper level of the shaft, courtyard, and L6, which is the deepest layer, and T, which are the layers, the ceramic material found in the layer located in the stairwell leading to the yard. So the pottery material found during this excavation is quite homogeneous from a chronological point of view, because the great majority of the pottery dates from the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, more precisely from the first half and the second half of the 3rd century BC. And it's also interesting to see that in the deepest layer, like L5 and L6, no pottery from the 2nd and the 1st century have been recorded. So the local ceramic production represents the clear majority of the material from the tomb, and the repertoire consists mainly in open vessel, usually made of alluvial clay or calcareous clay from Mariute area. So the main shape are this bowl with flattened rim, characterized by this flat and horizontal rim, who are production from Lake Mariute area. But also, we found a lot of different modules of echinus bowl. So this shape is really common in the Mediterranean world, varying in terms of shape or dimension. And they are really characteristic from the Egyptian assemblage from the Ptolemaic period. Here you can see some parallel of deep bowls, this kind of deep echinus bowl from Greek production, from the Athenian agora, and dating back from the 3rd century. Then also several exemplars of this small bowl with a short handle have been also found. This shape is particularly interesting because we found many parallels in the funerary context. For example, the funerary context of Gabari, and also Breccia has noted some of this vessel during the excavation of Chadby necropolis. Also, this carinated vessel are quite common in the filling layer of the Hypogeum Sea. They could be made of calcareous clay from Mareotic area or Nile silt with a black surface due to the post-firing process. Sorry, and the shape of the carination is close from The Greek exemplar found also in the Athenian Agora and dating back from the mid-3rd century BC. Along with these different type of plates, like the plates with triangular rim, which are imitation from earlier imported vessel. So they are also local production, mainly from Mareotic area. And what is interesting is that we have this really interesting surface treatment of red slip made by soaking, which is leaving these traces on the outer surface. Then another type of plates with rounded rim, a slightly later variant of the previous type, and progressively replacing it from the second half of the 3rd century. Also, in terms of imitation, this group of skifoil, this cup with rounded rim and quite oblique walls, are also really frequent. What is interesting is here is the bichromie of the surface, which is imitating the imported production from Rhodes. Then going back to the large vessel, this large basin with short and convex neck, which is really interesting because according to Cécile Arlot, this shape can derivate from some classical form and is dating from the early beginning of the 3rd century. Other parallels of this type have been already published in domestic contexts, such as in cricket ground excavation in Alexandria, but mostly in funerary context, like in Gabari, Adra, or Plantine necropolis. Also, this shape was frequently attested in Chadbir necropolis among the material from Breccia excavation, where they were enclosing the funerary hydria for the cremation remain. Unfortunately, in the filling of Hypogeum C, we didn't add any hydria. So then together we have another type of basin with flattened rim, and this interesting mortar, which inspired by the Hellenistic Athenian picrus rim mortar appearing at the beginning of the 3rd century. Another interesting point about the material from this complex is that the cooking vessel, particularly some shape like Lopades and Kakabei, inspired from Greek production. So these cooking vessels are really significant in the tomb. So here you have some exemplar of the Egyptian lopas, really close, really well known in the Greek world. And a large number of exemplars have a blackened surface blackened by fire, confirming their use in cooking preparation. Also, we found this exemplar of small size Kitra, belonging to Alexandrian production, appearing at the beginning of the 3rd century, and several exemplars of complete or almost complete Kakabei with globular or ovoid ovoid body. The shape itself is largely inspired by the Greek culinary shape, who seems to appear in the Egyptian repertoire around the beginning of the 3rd century BC. And also all our exemplars are blackened by fire. So the reason behind the presence of cooking vessel in the courtyard mainly seems difficult to determine. According to Cécile Arlot, this type of container could have been used during funerary banquets, during the preparation of meals, or in order to hold offering to the deceased. In Chadby Hypogeum, the presence of this closed vessel could also be probably linked somehow to the reoccupation of the tomb, especially in the stairwell. So it just, we have really few liquid vases, and it's forming a really heterogeneous group, but they find some parallel with the container from the early Ptolemaic period, the 3rd century BC, for example, in Gabari necropolis. Some imports have been also found during the excavation. So they remain really scarce in comparison with local Egyptian artifacts, but they are still present in the tomb. All the imported container identified in Chadby seems exclusively to be originally from the Aegean area, especially from Cyprus and Rhodian region. So, for example, there is this really interesting fragment, a single fragment of thrown tubular lamp. Comparable objects have been discovered in the Athenian agora of Athens. This one, this is a complete exemplar. And the exemplar found in Chadby is probably from Rhodian origin and dated from the 3rd century BC. They had been found together with this crater with downturn rim and this small echinus ball produced in Cyprus. Also, we have really few exemplars of Rhodian and Cnidian amphora from the beginning of the 3rd century BC. So, as I was explaining previously, we have most of the material from the courtyard is dated from the 3rd century BC. But some later vessels, probably to be considered as later intrusion, have been also noted in the different layer. So this subsequent container seem mainly to occur in the upper part of the field level, and occasionally and even exceptionally in the lower one. However, this later intrusion remain quite uncommon, and no pottery evidence posterior to the 1st century BC, at the really end of the Ptolemaic period, has been identified so far. So considering the scarcity of these few intrusions, it suggests that the upper part of the hypogeum, of the filling of the hypogeum, or part of it may have been slightly disturbed at some point. And it's not impossible that some of these fragments present in these upper levels correspond to the remain of the excavation and the clearing carried out by Breccia at the beginning of the 20th century. So, as an example, we have this fragment of base of carinated vessel showing this printed palmette in the bottom. It seems like this decoration doesn't seem to be attested during the 3rd century BC. also together with this cooking pot with short everted neck, a colrette, whose shape is a later form of the Hellenistic kitra and kakabei, and is more common during the 2nd and the 1st century BC. Also some Nile silt cooking vessel, like cooking jar, attested on other sides of Egypt during the 2nd and the 1st century BC. Also some small import from the same period, like these two Rhodian echinus bowl, along with some scifoil, all of them from Rhodian origin, and large majority of the Rhodian amphora found during the excavation consist in later production dated from the 2nd and the 1st century BC. So, as mentioned, the pottery from the Hypogeum C of Chadby, especially local vessel, find some parallel with both domestic and funerary contexts in Alexandria. While it may appear that some of these vessels are clearly connected with the funerary sphere, such as the small handle bowl and the big basin of or crater, already identified by Breccia during his research in the necropolis. He was identifying it as furnishing or offering material for the deceased. But all this shape can occur also in domestic context as well. Likewise, the cooking vessel and the vases for liquid, who are including, as you saw, some complete or almost complete exemplars, can also be connected with both funerary banquets performed in the necropolis or domestic activity or culinary preparation. So when considering this different element, it's difficult to state firmly that the pottery material found in the structure, in this complex, can be considered as a result of a gradual filling over the time, or if it was exclusively connected with the reoccupation and different phases of reoccupation of the structure. Then regarding the scarcity of the later pottery material, like material from the 2nd and 1st century BC, and its distribution in the different level, we could consider this later material as a result of both gradual filling and domestic activity. So the material discovered in the staircase is indeed quite homogeneous, like without any intrusion dating from the 3rd century BC. So it's clear that we can say that the reoccupation of this complex happened during this period, and the later element found in this area might then belong to the last occupation phase of this area of the necropolis. Thank you.
Thank you, Walt, for such a wonderful paper and for traveling us through the pottery found in Hypogeum C in Alexandria. I'm sure we're going to have plenty of things to discuss further on. So, off to our next speaker for this afternoon, Aya Salem, and her paper on osteoarchaeology, an overview of evidence from recent excavations in Alexandria.
Okay. If you don't mind, please raise your hand up if you thought that a dead person can tell us stories about the past. Oh, okay, great. So maybe most of us know what is osteoarchaeology? No? Or yes or no? Yes or no? I need to hear. Okay, if you don't know, I will explain this in few minutes. But now let me start from what Professor Kyriakos told us yesterday when he said there are a number of symmetry between Shadbi and Mustafa Kamel necropolis. In fact, the Ministry of Antiquity had discovered a lot of symmetry in this area since 2011, if I remember. And I was the lucky person who excavated, recorded, and dealt with human remains in almost of these sites. Because of that, I am here to share with you my experience in osteoarchaeology. So let's know what is the osteoarchaeology, the definition. Osteoarchaeology is a science study human remains in archaeological site. Okay, why we are study bone in archaeological site? Because study human remains in the most important part of archaeological evidence, most direct form of to give us information about what people were doing in the past. Let us imagine if we have text or beautiful things in the tomb, and also we have body of the owner of this tomb. What can say to us the truth? Huh? Oh, the text, or the saints, or the body of the owner of this tomb? What? All of them? Okay, great. For me, I think the bone can tell us the truth, because sometimes people write or draw them hopes. You understand me? But the bone tell us really what this person, who this person, how old it is, what the disease he has. You get the meaning? Okay. So I will start for what happened exactly to start osteoarchaeology in Alexandria. Simply in 2005 at Giza, in field school of Aira, there are a woman called Jessica Kaiser. This woman trained some inspector, Egyptian inspector. As you see, this is the name of them: Afaf Wahba, Ahmad Gabr, and Zainab Hashish. And also there are Maha Sayyah. After that, in field school 2007, Mr. Ahmad Omar training. Mr. Ahmad Omar, this is the director of training Alexandria and West Delta Training Center. And he is the one who carry this science and try to learn us in Alexandria how we can deal with human remains. And as you see, there are like a big team. He tried to learn us. Here we can see some names: Mustafa Shhata, Nadia Abdel Latif, Moga Ramadan, Shireen al-Morsi, Samar Abu Dahab, and me. Okay, how we can find this remain in the site? How we can find human remains in the site? Sometimes we found it in exhumation without any training, just bone. And this bone sometimes in situ as a skeleton and sometimes also as a disturbing bone. We can find it as a cremation, burned bone, and they put it in the vessels like Dr. Mona Haggak told us yesterday, and in order from the foot to the head or contrary. And we can also find the mummy. So this is the three types we can find human remains in archaeological site. Okay, we can say there are three big stages to record or deal with human remains in archaeological site. First of that, before excavation, we must make like database assessment, like historical background about the site we will go to excavate, collect map, and also know the type of excavation. As you know, there are different types of excavations. There are salvage excavations, there are missions, there are scientific excavations. So we must know exactly what the kind of excavation we will going to do. And after it choose the team. For example, if we go to work in cemetery, we must have someone know exactly how he can or she can deal with human remains. And prepare the archive. This is all before we go to excavate or dig the site. This is in general, not only in the cemetery site. For excavation, we can, at first we clean the area, as you see, and after determine the burial cut or the graves, as you see also, and after that take photo before we excavate the burial, and start from what we know to what we don't know to excavate the burial completely. And in this moment, we must know a little bit about anatomy of human. So to excavate or dig up the human remains or skeleton, we must know a little bit about the anatomy. After that, take photo again. After we clean and excavate all, take photo again. And there are different kind of photo we take in the site. First one, this one? I don't, yes, okay. First one, we make like a context photo to know the relation between the burial and another archaeological element. And second one, this is the general photo of the burial. You must see all details in the one photo. And third one, it's like a photo mosaic. We have a skeleton like this, and we take photo in the different place, and this is useful for drawing. This is the next step. And also we have 3D modeling. It's very useful for us when we make a salvage excavation because we don't have time to make all this process or drawing or something like this. So we use 3D modeling to draw after, to know more after, because sometimes we don't have time to make everything very well in the site. So also we drawing. There are two types to drawing. First one is manual. It's so difficult and take a lot of time. If we try to draw a skeleton, maybe it's take 1 week if we make it manual. But also, as I told you before, that there are photo mosaic, and we can use also 3D modeling to draw digital by Illustrator, for example, as you see here in this example. And after we start to record. Actually, we record everything, even the weather of the day. We record everything, and we have a diary, of course, to record, and also we have a sheet to mention and write everything related of this burial or human remains. And also we have like a diagram to mention what we have, what we don't have. I know this is need only one lecture to explain, but I try to get it very quickly. Sorry. Okay. Okay, يا دكتور حاضر. And there are another methodology of to record also human remains. As I said to you that there are inhumation. In inhumation we can find a skeleton complete and a disturbing bone. In disturbing bone we use this sheet. This sheet to know minimum number of individual we have. And this method we make in Shadbi necropolis. And post excavation, after we finish all this stage, we start to record each bone, and we try to put in anatomical position and take photo again and make analysis, estimation of sex and age. And after all this, we put it in the storage with label for with all information about this period. So now we will talk about the study case from Alexandria, especially in Eastern Alexandria. As you see, all this is a site. This is the Sauvage excavation. Had been take place in since 2011, and I have 130 from individual from this Sauvage excavation. And for Shadbi necropolis, I had a great honor in to participate in this project. By the work in the progress, I didn't finish the work until now, and I work especially in Hypogeum A, room C, and in this Hypogeum we have 3 male, 2 female, and 3 juvenile, and also we have 3 we can't determine the sex. Total now in this room we have 11 skeleton, but we need to complete the work to know more about Shadbi necropolis. We will talk now about burial practice in those sites. And first of all, sample pit. We have like a rectangle sample pit with one individual. And sometimes it takes the shape of oval, and sometimes it was not for one, maybe it's a multi-burial, not only for one, as this one. So also we have like a rock cut tomb, and there are Haddad. Yesterday, Professor Mona talked about the Haddad site. Haddad site around 300 meters east of Shadbi necropolis, and we have 4 rooms, 38 locally, 44 locally slabs, 28 inscription. I'm sorry I can't put a photo because the site under publication. And there are also 6 tombs. This example from Kafr Abdu, 2019. And also there are arch tomb, and this example from Al Abd excavation, and another one from Tiba excavation 2012. For body treatment, we have mummification in Eastern cemetery. This example from Zankaloni. As you see, you can note this black material. And also this from Al Haddad site. And also there are remains of black material here. And after I make IR analysis, I found this is, there are textile, linen textile, and also there are juniper resin. So we have mummy inside Eastern cemetery in Alexandria. And for inhumation, we have a different kind. It is the most common kind in Alexandria. And we have, as you see, different type, different position. We can see this is in inhumation. And for cremation, we have, I have for my material two examples, one from Al-Haddad, another one from Tiba. And as I said to you before, that they put the human remains after they burn it in the fuzzle and by order from the head to the foot. But unfortunately, until now, we didn't open this fuzzle because we don't have a specialist of this. So we wait for make a cooperation between CO Alex and the Ministry of Antiquity to open it. For body position, we have different kind of body position, like extended burial, anterior up, and also tendon flexed, laid on left side. And there are also loosely flexed, laid on left side. We can see here, this is the most common position we found of all sides. This is extended, like you see, and this is laid on left. This is the burial of a child laid on left side. And this one, we have only one case of this position. You can see this is a man laid on the back, but the leg is flexed. I don't know, this is the first time I see this example from Sporting 2021. For the head orientation, we have interior up and also chin and chest and the face in the north. This one, I don't know you see well or not, but you can see here the skull, interior up. That means that's the face like this. And this one, chin and chest, like the chin and chest, like this. And the next one, this is the face in the east. And this is other position of the head. For hand placement, we have like this, both hand above the pelvis, or both hand beside the femur, left hand catch right hand, or one hand on the chest. For the feet placement, we have extended feet pointed and direction in the left or on the right. For coffin, we have burial jar. This type, it's also common. They use two pottery jar, and put a skeleton inside. And in this case, the skeleton is too long, and they use amphora to make like extension for the burial. And another kind, they reuse amphora to put a child burial. And this one I would like to ask because it's different. It's from Qom Aziza al-Bahira, and they use, as you see, like 12 amphora surrounded the burial jar, and they put inside the burial jar a skeleton. But I don't know if someone see something like this in different place, please let me know. And also for grave gods, we have a coin inside the mouth. This is a very common ritual to pay to the one who brings the dead person to in the river, in the. Okay, sorry. Yes. And also we have locally slab. This is a design of door, and this design also, and there are this one. This from Tiba, and I have honor to publish with Professor Mohammed Abdel Ghani in Abgadiyat, I think, yes. And there are terracotta figure. And also we have a stamped hand, flask, and gold jewelry. And for the result, we can say almost from this material, or we have like 60% locally, and 30% for simple pit grave, and 5% for cyst tomb, and 5% also for arch tomb. And for body treatment, almost burial, I found it's inhumation. After that, we can put cremation and mummification. And thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I'm so sorry because I'm so nervous, but if you have any question, I will be pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Aya, for another great lecture, quite interactive one. And apparently so dead men do tell tales. And yeah, Jack Sparrow was wrong in the Pirates of the Caribbean, so yeah, they can speak of several things. So I'm sure there are going to be more questions coming on. In the meantime, just bear with me for a couple of seconds until I upload my PowerPoint. Should be this one. Okay, so I think it's time for us to move a little bit to the west, northwest, as a matter of fact, and focus a little bit more on Greek stuff, coming mostly from mainland Greece, but at the same time from the Aegean and Crete. My lecture is going to be on death and burial in Hellenistic Greece. Burials are recognized as a valuable source for discussing an array of topics, apparently so. Cross-disciplinary approaches to burial allow us to unpack sophisticated sociocultural aspects of the human past, as we've heard already, including social relationships and identities, about which we've heard yesterday, social structure, we've been hearing about it, throughout the workshop, diet and health, population histories, and individual biographies, emotional discourses, ritualized practices, migrations, and of course, cosmologies. Static correlation between the buried individual and his funerary inventory has now been replaced by a reflexive attitude. The dead do not bury themselves, of course. Therefore, the treatment of the deceased tells us quite a lot about the living society. But we have rarely made death attitudes towards it, its management and cultural elaboration, the focus of our mortuary archaeologies. Instead, we've used mortuary practices as a window into past social organization, ethnic affiliation, cultural relationships, and so on and so forth. The fact that the evidence is drawn from the context of death and disposal has been, if not incidental, then certainly marginal to our research. However, the mortuary context is a specific cultural location. The grave is not a Roman Pompeii in which past societies are instantly fossilized. It's much more, many things more. Burial evidence is a type of evidence furnished both by artifacts and ideologies, and therefore is informative for understanding social and cultural realities. Burials can provide us with insights into the individual social persona otherwise unnoticed, while their subterranean nature often makes them the only source of information. Nonetheless, one should also bear in mind that one of the oft-repeated, if less than popular, maxims of archaeological research is that negative evidence, which basically means the absence of any material trace of human activity, is just as valuable as the richest and most copious finds. It is not necessary for an ideology to exist or be hidden under symbolisms in a grave. It may simply not be there. In recent years, the topic of ancient Greek death and burial in classical antiquity, broadly defined, has been increasingly addressed in international conferences, monographs, collected volumes, and journals. After having been neglected for decades, or the province of a relatively small group of scholars, Greek death and burial has gradually become central to the research agenda of classical archaeologists. This development can mainly be traced from the early 70s of the last century and has picked up pace in a sustained fashion at the beginning of the new millennium, with studies on pre-Hellenistic cemeteries having the lion's share. Yet only rarely is the complex and fragmentary picture of Hellenistic Greece being systematically considered. Although many Hellenistic burials have been found and many more are being discovered each year, information about them remains incomplete. Mortuary practices of the Hellenistic period have largely been treated through the documentation and publication of individual cemeteries, single burials, Macedonian tombs and funerary art, of course, or of specific types of funerary material, mainly grave stele, pottery, and figurines. Specific types of evidence are often pulled out of their context or studied individually, while descriptive and comparative analyses are often employed in order to reconstruct a vague picture of the cultural history of sites through their cemeteries. There is limited work in book form that attempts a synthetic approach to the Hellenistic burial record of Greece, of course. It can crudely be said that the more complex a past society, the less research has been devoted to its cemeteries proper. But questions about funerary art, burial wealth, aesthetics, or technology, important as they are, cannot be answered until we have understood the logic of the rituals involved in the creation of the archaeological record. Attempts to reconstruct sites would largely benefit from the richer knowledge of their cemeteries. Even if these are partly known from documentary sources, the latter are not always trustworthy. In this general framework, my forthcoming volume attempts to fill the gap by exploring new lines of thought, questioning established ways of reading Hellenistic burials, take stock of recent developments, and to achieve a complete coverage of death and burial in Hellenistic Greece, rather than to provide a collection of current research agendas. However, main aim of my lecture this evening is, of course, not to advertise my book, which has a long way still to go, but to raise questions, note some general trends, mark tendencies, and to trigger creative thinking on 3 out of the many more aspects of the Hellenistic burial ritual. The first one is going to be the location of Hellenistic cemeteries in the landscape. The second one will be the disposal of the dead in the grave. And the third and last for this evening, the placement of the offerings into the grave. Of course, such a study has to overcome major obstacles. Few regional studies exist on Hellenistic burials, and most of the information has to be gathered from dispersed sources. Published reports lacking specific analysis of skeletal materials from any cemetery render difficult any evaluation of what authors mean when they identify the remains of male or female or even children. Our knowledge of populations in the Hellenistic period is limited to a number of site-specific bioarchaeological studies, and most assessments of burials are results of observations made by archaeologists in the field. But let us take one step at a time. Accessibility to cemeteries was of major concern in Hellenistic Greece. Access for the ekphora, the second part of the three-act drama of a Greek funeral, which could entail a pompi, a procession that is, of several hundred meters from the settlement and the house of the dead, was certainly facilitated in this way. Even a few hundred meters distance through rough field is quite a long way to transport a body, considering the slow walking pace for the performance of lament and for the elders to keep on track. If funerals did indeed take place before dawn, as written sources inform us, when visibility was rather low, then the effort would have been even greater. Hellenistic cemeteries are therefore placed alongside roads in a relatively flat areas. It is probable that this association of cemeteries with roads was mainly down to sheer convenience than anything else. Excavation and surface survey evidence suggests that the overall number of settlements and cemeteries gradually reached a peak in the late classical, early Hellenistic period in Greece. By the mid-Hellenistic period, intensified settlement nucleation suggests the gradual consolidations of populations near or even into the most prominent urban centers of the time. This is mirrored by the burial evidence and the gradual accumulation of burials into the cemeteries of major urban centers. The pattern culminated in the late Hellenistic period as a result of shifting settlement cemetery distributional patterns, partly due to changes in agricultural strategies and partly to alterations in population growth, of course. The wider transformations of the urban landscape in the Hellenistic period did not merely produce proportionally varying frequencies of burials over time, but also changes in the intra-cemetery spatial distribution of burials, allowing for at least 4 main categories of burial grounds to emerge. Urban cemeteries, that is, cemeteries of large urban sites like Aegeia, which is again a royal site, of course, Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, Thessaloniki, Megara, and many more sites. These are densely occupied and extensive cemeteries, often with remarkable continuity and longevity in use, having an impact to their spatial organization either in orderly groupings of graves in rows upon rows or in far more messy arrangements of graves. They are composed of a wide variety of grave forms, regularly arranged in row segregated clusters that are not always easy to distinguish. Funerary markers, proper grave stele, funerary sculpture, or even earthen mounds and stone-made enclosures are rather frequent in the crowded urban cemeteries, implying that the need to demarcate the dead in there was greater in these sort of cemeteries. Peri-urban cemeteries. Several distinct burial grounds, such as one at Chania in the island of Crete, are located on the periphery of proper and formal urban cemeteries and represent resting places for people, both adult and sub-adult, of lower social strata, who were allocated a marginal burial place. These cemeteries do not yield significant mortuary variability, with usual 1 to 2 grave types being employed. The third category is rural cemeteries. These are associated with peripheral sites and demonstrate a clear and spatial arrangement and some, if not slight, mortuary variability. We're talking about 2 to 4 grave types being present. The fourth category considers rural burials, something that is completely disassociated from proper cemeteries. Not all burials are found associated with settlements and cemeteries, as some seem to have been placed some distance from any, at least so far as we can tell, farmstead or settlement. They are located in fertile and well-watered land, while their grave forms are anything but poorly or hastily made. Although isolation could simply imply that the role of the individual as a member of society was being denied through their exclusion from the community, the aforementioned observations brought together lead me to argue differently. I tend to believe that these are rural burials, burials on a site sufficiently distant from any settlement, to be inexplicable in terms of the location of such settlements, in a location chosen on grounds of the ownership of rural land. In other words, these people are not buried in formal city cemeteries, but in distant, far distant territories, where probably their properties are located, further implying a divide between a proper urban population and an agrarian class of people whose burials also functioned as territorial markers, marking their territories. On the screen, one such a case, which is a Macedonian tomb, located in the middle of nowhere in northern Greece, on a rather mountainous landscape, literally at the beginning of a high and really steep slope, overseeing and overlooking, you can see here the entrance to the tomb, overseeing and overlooking arable land. Probably this guy owned the place up there. To these four categories, one can also add a fifth one, however, that cannot be identified as a cemetery proper, rather as a sort of burial ground. I refer to burials in non-funerary contexts that increased significantly in the Hellenistic period. But at this stage, I would like to adopt a different method of approaching cemeteries. Although the aforementioned classification of Hellenistic cemetery layouts displays varying degrees of mortuary variability, the way adults are being treated in these cemeteries yields minimal differences, but these are more elaborate for children, implying that an element of selection and evidently conscious disposal of the dead was in practice. And here I shall stay for a bit longer. Bioarchaeological analysis indicates a drop in the overall number of child burials by the 4th century BC, a relatively low number in the Hellenistic period with a marked decrease in the 2nd and 1st century BC. The classical formal infant and young child type of burial cluster is rather uncommon in the Hellenistic period. The few such burial clusters known are neither that extensive nor clearly separated from adult burials, nor set by city gates or roads leading to important sanctuaries. Instead, they are comprised of a limited number of child burials around adult burials, whilst being in proximity to each other in the often crowded Hellenistic cemeteries. While some young children received formal burial in communal burial grounds, the number of infant burials from these grounds is nowhere near the expected frequency of the very young. A limited number of intramural child burials from Dimitrias in Thessaly, Athens, Neophaliro, and Rhodes, individually placed or arranged in minor clusters of 2 to 3 burials, often along with adult burials, suggests that children were sometimes buried intramuros, a practice reminiscent of earlier burial customs. Even though such a practice may be seen for adults too, what is clearly a distinctive attribute of children is their intramural burial within domestic space, within houses, a practice so far unattested for adults. A handful of child burials, cremation and inhumation in Athens, Eretria, Atalanta, Sparta, and many more sites have been found within proper domestic space, within houses, adjacent to structural remains or under the floor of what is thought to be a house. The custom of placing a child burial close to or inside a house is not common in Hellenistic Greece at all. Another and rather well-known example of disposal in non-funerary context comes from Athens. In a well at the Athenian Agora that was sealed off sometime around 150 BC, the skeletal human remains of an adult, a child around 11 years of age, and some 450 fetuses, neonates or infants, were found. The well also contained the faunal remains of more than 130 dogs. Recent studies have suggested that the bulk of the infants in the well probably died of natural causes, while a smaller number may have been victims of infanticide. Two more similar Hellenistic deposits in wells are also known. One with bones of at least 260 prematures, it's located at the Agora of Ancient Messini in the Peloponnese, and another with 20 infants and 1,000 canine bones comes from Eretria. Both of them date to the early 3rd century BC. There is no written evidence to account for infant disposal in wells, and the historical and ethnographic parallels can only provide information on the range of possible social and individual motivations behind the practice. Although varying reasons can lie masked behind each one of the above burial deposits, they both illustrate a complex picture in the spatial redistribution of burials in the Hellenistic period, where varying modes of age segregation in death may have been employed. In any case, they are not the result of random behavior. So, let's move on to placing the dead in the grave. As soon as the cortege arrived at the gravesite, there followed the entombment, entafiasmos in Greece, which is the lowering of the dead into their final residence, and essentially the only part usually preserved for archaeological study. The grave size usually varied according to the size of the deceased buried. Yet, child and female burials have often been recovered from large and spacious graves, with the female burials being particularly well furnished and relatively tall individuals from rather small graves with few, if any, offerings. It thus seemed likely that the grave size did not always correspond to the deceased age or sex, but rather to restrictions imposed by the deceased status. Already by the mid-4th century BC, a tendency towards simpler and rather inexpensive grave forms seems to emerge in every region in Greece. Slab-covered graves would have definitely been modest. Conglomerate was sometimes used to cover simple pits, although relatively flat stone slabs were more frequent. Burial in tile graves, however, was a very popular way of burying the dead. Tiles were certainly cheap, as we become aware from public architecture of tiles costing 1 to 5 obols each. By the Hellenistic period, the dead were buried in tile graves in most parts of the Greek world, suggesting that the tile grave was probably not a grave form employed by a specific social group, but rather a trend imposed by economic, even intrinsic choices. This is not surprising, of course. At any given moment, a society may include more than any grave types without the people themselves making any distinction between them. In addition to the rather simple and unremarkable grave forms briefly discussed, however, various monumental tombs of considerable wealth and splendor were increasingly constructed by the late 4th century BC. By the term monumental tombs here, I refer to a rather heterogeneous group of large, mainly freestanding burial monuments of considerable expenditure and rareness that seem to embrace the concept of monumentality, and they're composed of a number of elements to qualify the denotation. For something to be monumental in the context of the ancient world, it must be made of a durable material, display of high level of technical achievement, of course relative to the period, and to be of monumental size. Of course, monumentality also includes a concept of ritual. These burial monuments may vary from large peribolous tombs and small-sized chamber tombs to larger burial complexes and Macedonian tombs proper, that were used for both individual and multiple burials, distributed in numerous sarcophagi against their internal walls. Such tombs are extremely rare in earlier periods in Greece, in contrast to the Hellenistic, when they are widely dispersed. They are located in urban or peripheral cemeteries or in isolation, and in rather prominent places, such as alongside roads in the midst of or overseeing arable land. If we regard the effect of permanence monumental tombs were provided with due to their large-scale construction as aiming to memorialize their owner's status as prominent individuals, then these people must have been members of the spending and rather heterogeneous Hellenistic elite. possessors or at least representatives of political, religious, economic, or even symbolic power derived their wealth mainly from extensive land holdings, but also from trade, taxes, harbor dues, royal denotations, etc., and were able of even helping a city in military or financial extremity. Be they urban bourgeoisie or wealthy landlords, those buried in monumental tombs use the same eloquent means, the tombs themselves, for promoting their political and territorial claims in a period, the Hellenistic, where these were of considerable importance. To the extent that the task of building large-scale tombs required a long-term commitment, as well as the ability to control resources and coordinate substantial investments of labor, monumental tombs could also be regarded as placed where the economic and social focus of their owners were. Burial at a central place could be equated with reflecting elite regard for urban life, and burial at a remote location with land holding. Their placement next to or even far from modest grave types functioned as an additional mode of appraisal, creating hierarchical relationships between the dead, as those buried in the tombs were emphatically separated from those buried around them. It is thus made possible to assume that in the Hellenistic period, monumental tombs created a sense of group identity, or even distinct identities. Individual inhumations in the Hellenistic period appear to be non-normative. The bodies within the graves display a lack of interregional uniformity in terms of positioning and orientation. Especially the latter vary significantly, with tendencies that range from apparently random orientation to following specific orientation within the limits of a single cemetery that may further be dictated by other parameters. Thus, for example, at Aegynio and Edessa, two sites in Macedonia, orientation of the dead is dictated by sex. Males face to the west and females to the east. In Eastern Low Greece, a region in central Greece, orientation is dictated by local tradition. The dead normally face to the east in an entire region, not site. In Kerameikos, in the few known Hellenistic tombs there, orientation is dictated by roads often leading to shrines and sanctuaries. At Veroia, again in northern Greece, orientation of the dead seems to be dictated by roads, a pattern also noted for those individuals buried in rock-cut chamber tombs, monumental tombs. Individual inhumation burial was the norm, but multiple burials also exist. The placing of individuals in the same grave does not seem to have always been a solution dictated by prudence, as seen on the screen, but rather by social conventions. You see on the screen, you see an adult and a child skeletons placed in a rather irregular way, of at least ways we've been used to see in graves. For instance, and among other things, females share significantly more attributes with children than either share with men, while female relatives were probably responsible for preparing the body of an infant and young child observations, suggesting that an association in death may often reflect a relationship in life. In this case, a relationship that seems to be fading away, or at least changing in the Hellenistic period, where the emphasis was gradually turned elsewhere. But inhumation is not the only rite attested in Hellenistic Greece, as cremation was also practiced though in a much more limited scale. The small number of known cremation, as well as their marked presence in urban cemeteries rather than rural ones, suggests that the rite was restricted to a few people. The rite would require significant preparation and much labor in order to be accomplished with perfection and at once. The post-mortem glory of the dead, their soul's peace, as well as the cremator's reputation, and goals would have been in stake here. A large quantity of wood had to be piled up, which the deceased was then placed on. Experimental archaeology has shown that successful cremation of a human body requires the burning of about a ton of dry wood, while full cremation is accomplished only after at least 8 hours. When cremation was over, remains were buried in situ, the so-called primary cremation burials, or more frequently, they were collected and stored in ash urns, the so-called secondary cremations. The third and last part of my lecture has to do with placing the offerings, rather than the offerings themselves. As I mentioned yesterday, Hubi Nielsen, in her analysis of the frequency of categories of grave goods found in Athenian burials of Hellenistic times, she notes that Hellenistic grave goods are not included since the number of grave goods from this period is too low to be statistically meaningful. Although such modesty seems to be a marked tendency for burials throughout Hellenistic Greece, and a general pattern of behavior can be elucidated, the provision of some burials with offerings is not homogeneously distributed. It varies in time and space, implying a great diversity of individual choices. Some burials may or may not conform with the general tendency of furnishing graves in that cemetery or region, while specific types of offerings that are often considered to be distinct attributes of males, females, or children, such as terracotta figurines or miniature vases, may often display a wider distribution in burials that cross-cut age and sex differences. Yet a few burials stand out with their considerable number and or diversity of burial offerings already from the late 4th century BC, a tendency which becomes stronger by the 2nd century BC, suggesting that some individuals or social groups are gradually viewed as qualitatively different. Such divergence from the modest norm fits well within two wider patterns observed in Hellenistic Greece. The differentiation in matter of detail noted in burials from the early Hellenistic to the late Hellenistic period, and the overall growing mortuary divide noted in the quantity and quality of offerings deposited in graves, resulting in many too rich graves next to too poor ones. Apparently, the new sociopolitical system that is characterized by ideals of wealth and social display affected gender roles and pervaded burial customs. For most burials, the available information suggests that the offerings were placed in the grave, crowded or distributed around the body in no apparent order, probably dictated by the availability of space. Nonetheless, persistence can be noted in placing the offerings primarily around the head and secondarily between the lower limbs, the legs. But in a number of graves, the offerings seem to occupy rather conspicuous places in relation to the dead or even to one another, denoting their careful placement. Some of the coins deposited in graves were found in proximity to the skull and may have represented the obolos with which the dead paid their passage money to the ferryman, Haron. Strigils and mirrors have often been found set very close to the deceased's hands, as if they were originally held, necklaces on the chest, and of course, wreaths and diadems on or near the skull, as if they were originally worn. Careful placement is made more explicit by the deposition of vases. These may be set upright or upside down in specific spots over or around the skeleton, while some have been found covering figurines or smaller vases, indicating a rather deliberate placement. Since many vases were found in upright position and at prominent places in the grave or in relation to the dead, make it possible, if not likely, that these contained their liquid offerings, but only content analysis can prove such a claim. Even though the random placement of most vases suggests that placing them in graves with their contents was probably not the norm, the possibility that their contents or the actual offerings were displayed and then removed, destroyed, consumed, or even symbolically placed inside or outside the grave, in other words, they were thought to be there, should not be ruled out, especially within a proper funerary ritual. So to wrap it up and to sum it. Hellenistic Greece, with its great regional diversity, variety of community forms and networks, political trajectories, geographical connections, variable links with long-distance trade routes, and inland mountain economies, the role of mystic cults, etc., demonstrates considerable regional mortuary variability. The regional and temporal fluctuations noted in the frequency, spatial distribution, and spatial arrangement of burials, in the varying degrees of inclusivity of people in communal burial grounds, that is, proper cemeteries, and of exclusivity, of course, from these same contexts, should be understood as reflections of shifts in the symbolism of burial within Hellenistic society, and not necessarily as a trustworthy indicator of alteration in mortality rates. The latter is most difficult to analyze, since the population of an ancient city's cemeteries is not a direct reflection of the total population of the city. Anyhow, conclusions concerning Hellenistic burials in Greece might, of course, change upon future publication of relevant archaeological contexts, proper Hellenistic contexts, with the advent of new discoveries, or through the application of more refined dating, especially between separating early and late Hellenistic burials, excavation and analytical methods. What clearly emerges from this survey of evidence presented to you today is the wide degree of variation in what are often loosely termed customary Hellenistic burials. If death is indeed an occasion or opportunity for display in the Hellenistic period, then the meaning of this opportunity varies not only geographically, but also chronologically and along the dimensions of gender, age, and status. Thank you for your patience. And I'm going to have a glass of water first and then call the ladies to join me up here. Back to my usual role. This session, I think, was had three rather complementary papers, which in my mind at least fit together quite well, as they pointed out several different things amongst each other, but at the same time things that we do come across when excavating or even studying Hellenistic cemeteries, and not just proper evidence, but mainly problems we deal with when studying Hellenistic cemeteries in particular. So I'm sure you're going to have a hell of a lot of questions and comments for each one of the speakers. I don't know if you want us to keep the order of papers to you. So perhaps questions or anything you would like to comment on Ott's paper on pottery from the Hypogeum South Necropolis? Yes, Anna, please.
Thank you very much for this.
Could you?
Thank you very much for this illuminating presentation. You have showed us a variety of cooking vessels originating from the courtyard of the Hypogeum, therefore bringing up the issue of the preparation of the meals. Have you traced any facilities or structures at the site that could be associated with the preparation of the meals? Or, to put it in other words, shall we consider the preparation of the meals as an integral part of the funerary rituals taking place at the gravesite? Or should we possibly investigate the possibility that the meals are prepared elsewhere, possibly far away from the cemetery, and the meals are just consumed at the gravesite? Thank you.
So thank you for your question. Actually, Christoph Römmel, who was the archaeologist excavating explained me that they found some really light traces of ashes in the stairwell. So that means that it could have been related to the reoccupation or the shelter, the occupation of the stairwell itself. After considering the preparation of the meal in the surrounding of the tomb, I have to say that I have no clue about it. So I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Hagar.
Thank you, Mrs. Simoni, for this really informative lecture. I don't know whether I understood correctly or not that you haven't found first century pottery at all.
First century?
Yes? First century BC.
First century BC, some shapes could go from the end of the second, beginning of the of the first century BC, but it's not the majority of the material.
But are these first century BC pieces are from the layer that you spoke of, that it might have been a kind of dumping area for bridges excavation?
Yes, exactly, and it's mostly in the upper layer of the filling of the courtyard.
Upper layer?
Yeah, the upper layer.
So it might not be original in the site.
No.
This is a very important piece of information about Chadbi as a whole. Sure. And I realize from you and from Schmidt's book, Schmidt and Rommel, that it had never been used for burying. But having these ashes and having used cooking pots means that it was used for domestic purposes, which is also important in this context because now we know about certain stages in Chadbi that it's been ceased to use it for burying. The whole complexes, the whole area, which means that it was allowed at that time for a family or more to use Hypogeum C for domestic. Am I correct?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may add on Professor Hagag's thought, if we're not familiar with the site at all, and even you didn't tell us that the pottery was coming from Hypogeum C, which is let's call it a burial structure, by looking at the pottery per se, I wouldn't have thought that it was coming from a grave, but rather from a house. I mean, yeah. Any other question? Yes, Laura, on the far left, please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question comes as a result of the two previous ones. We saw that the material from the 2nd and the 1st century BC is very fragmentary. So it's obvious that it has to do with the refuse and this dumping that has occurred. So my question is specifically about the cooking pots that Anna asked. In what condition are those found? Because we saw, I think, 2 pictures, but as a whole, the cooking pots, are they found almost complete, 50–60% complete, or are they very fragmentary?
I would say for the complete shape like the kitra and the kakabe, it's let's say 80% complete. But for the open shape like the lopades, only small pieces.
That's interesting.
It's more the closed cooking vessel are almost complete. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, yes.
So, thank you, all of you, for these beautiful presentations. And the question comes to you. Could I can't hold myself now. You've started with goals, so I have to.
The middle speaker, but anyhow.
But
yeah,
I think it's not relevant to any of the discussions. You really you started the very beginning of your lecture is the motto that we have brought up, all of us, in studies related to funerary archaeology. People never bury themselves. Parker Spears in 1993 was like living in my head. So I read this motto in every almost thesis, and I remember that was also repeated in the second Hellenistic workshop unit discussion. My question is, after rethinking the case of the necropolis of Alexandria, the way that it's organized. Of course, practically and in real life, people never bury themselves because they are dead already. Okay, but the preparation of this part of this stage of life, especially in Alexandria, in the way that the social structures are indicated through the development of the plan of the cemetery, of the necropolis, of smaller cemeteries, the social structures we find. Can we say that are really never bury themselves? And that is, I mean, in case of Shadby, for example, when this structure, like the East Burial Unit is getting organized, and I don't think it's organized within a week, but takes years, months, maybe years. So the guy or the guys who were in the clearance chamber, I think they knew that they're gonna end up there. Maybe. I have this feeling. So yeah, a comment on that, like we have a discussion, it could have been the day after, but sorry, it was just reminded me my youth. Okay.
We even feel it today. When we visit a tomb, we think of ourselves in the same place.
Can I add something else? As an anthropological comment to that, I mean, when you said that, it was not Alexandria that came to my mind, but the very recent funeral we had in Greece for a very, very famous composer, Mikis Theodorakis. Everybody knows Theodorakis, Zorba the Greek, the music. So this guy has designed his tomb, his placement, his inscription, the process, in fact, the funeral itself. Yet, after his death, there was a sort of conflict between his children if they're going to follow 100% the plan of the funeral or not. And his favorite daughter was against. So the non-favorite, in fact, won by the force of law, by the force of the testament of the will of Theodorakis through the lawyer. So in the end, Theodorakis did what he wanted. I mean, in special cases. But anyway, you know, just if you don't mind to make a discussion in this level. Thank you.
But Rosa's Macedonian, they're designed.
They're designed.
They're designed by
Yeah.
their own.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And the Egyptian.
Can I first answer these questions and then?
In reality, I wanted to add a piece of evidence to what Yaakov said.
Okay.
And I refer to a papyrus from Oxyrhynchus. The deceased left a will for his family to build to him a tomb with a pyramidal superstructure above. This indicates a specific type. This pyramid should require at least one room with pyramid above. So perhaps people practice that one.
Absolutely. I agree with all of you. I mean, as a matter of fact, otherwise I would have been observed. Problem is that funerary monuments per se, like a proper grave type, a proper grave monument, can be ordered in advance, can be designed. Its construction can be overseen by the owner. He or she could even have a picnic there and enjoy life while overseeing death, coming upon them. But at the exact moment of burial, he or she are not there. So somebody else takes over. And this stage is called, what broadly defined as ritual. So to this part of the process, the phrase, the dead do not bury themselves, belong not to the construction of the grave. Okay? When it comes to Ptolemaic Egypt, in my mind, we do have, as I pointed out and I said yesterday, between Macedonian tombs and the tomb at Sapti, we have a hell of a lot of differences. And again, to my mind, more than similarities when it comes to proper burial customs of these two periods. The parameter of regionality, which is affected by local conditions, socio-political endeavors, climate, people, religion, emphasis, you name the things there, can absolutely have an impact on the way people bury their dead. You're absolutely right to emphasize that the focus in Ptolemaic burials, as the one at Chapi, the emphasis is on, let's say, slightly more on a religious, if not sacred thing, okay, rather than a social. I mean, that's the discussion we had yesterday. Whereas when it comes to Greece, I think the things there are more balanced, inevitably. Inevitably. And as Professor Plantos said yesterday, in the case of Greece, because I'm not that familiar with Ptolemaic things yet, but I hope I will be in the near future. We do have the Orphic texts. We do have things like that, you know, get us through the ritual process. Or again, we do have monumental iconography and Macedonian type tombs with religious affinities and aspirations behind or in front of them, but that's it. Everything else has to do with wealthy people, people in top of the socio-political pyramid, that they control not just their burial ritual, even when they're not there, but absolutely everything. So, yeah.
And by the way, Parker Pearson in 1983, after that, he began an excavation interpretation of the Stone Age monument as a funerary temple.
Yeah.
After, next to the cemetery. So not only completely organized, but also, you know.
But it's not just Parker Pearson. I mean, many came after him. I mean,
It's a
yeah.
Okay.
Anyone? Yes, please. Yeah.
Hello again. Yesterday we were talking about the tomb in Alexandria, and we came across.
Question addressed to me. Ah, okay.
Yeah, it's all for you. We were talking about the tomb in Alexandria, and we come across the court, and we spoke that maybe the court was that they visited the tomb and they spent the day in the tomb. And we came across the Al-Abd excavation, and we talked about what some of the finds. One of the interesting finds also that it was very common to find cooking ware in Al-Abd excavation in the tombs, around the tombs, and it was used. And it was, even we found in some corner of one of the tombs, we found that they stored the cooking ware, the openware, one in each other. It was about 1 meter high of cooking ware it's stored together. So it's very clear that they visited the tombs in the festivals, and they spent the day and maybe also the night. They spent the night and drink a lot, because a lot of wine and beer jars we found there. They did everything. So it's very common to have such pottery shares in our excavation around the area. And that reminds me that I want to share something with Dr. Mona, but maybe later. In 2016, we excavated a site in 25th of Port Street. It's about 50 meters of Shadbi. And we found a tomb there, but we couldn't complete so much because it had a high level of underground water. we found the very similar type of pottery shards inside the tomb itself. Inside the courts in front of the locales. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to you all. I have an opinion I would like to share with Aya about the burial use of the amphorae. I think this is not strange at all because this is a very normal behavior. Ancient people used to use all things they thought they're gonna throw away, but in a new use. So, I saw a lot of using for amphorae in building walls and parts of houses and also quay or sidewalk in harbor. This is very common behavior. Yani. Okay, so when we see it in burial, it's okay. Yani. Okay. They used to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you all for your valuable presentation. I have two questions and one comment for Aya. You said that about 10% of burials in the Eastern necropolis is mummification. Yes. To which date these mummified bodies? Okay. For the other question, you said there are many positions for the deceased, to left, to right, and did you study this and give an indication of what is referring? Is it referring to the belief of the deceased or what? For my comment, it was about the shape of amphora around the body. I think it's like support for the burial in the middle, and they supported by the reused amphora. Okay. And I think it's like supporting the kissed graves with slabs of stones. So they used the amphora for the same reason for this burial. And thank you all. Not parallel with amphora, I think parallel with slabs of stones only, but I think it's the same way to support with amphora, reused amphora. It may give them the same meaning.
Okay. Thank you for your comment and your opinion about the amphora grave. For the dating of mummification, we found it in two sites. One of them excavated 2016 called Zenkaloni. It's also a Sauvage excavation around 2nd century BC. And another one in Haddad, it's a Hellenistic tomb from 3rd century, I think, yes, BC.
So the most oldest mummification was from the 3rd century?
Yes. Yeah. This is what I say because in the beginning, when I found this material above the skeleton, I suggest that maybe it's a soft tissue or something. So I tried to make analysis, and after that, I know this is the remain of mummification material. Yes. And another question, sorry.
For the other questions, the positions of each body.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, there are several studies about position, and for example, in Zenkaloni site, there are like a main burial. This is like a sheaf or something, and all burial direct to this one. Until now, we going in process to study all this. Until now, I didn't finish, sorry. But there are exactly something related of position of burial and behavior, maybe religions. Sometimes they put something, as I said to you, there are a main burial, and all burial direct to this one. But until now, I still study, so I don't know. Okay, I will study Shadbi at first. I promise you. Okay. Thank you.
Well, I may have a parallel to the burial with the amphora.
Yeah.
It's a quite distant one, but it's a contemporaneous one. It comes from the Black Sea area. In many of the cemeteries there, they use amphorae either to delimit their tumuli, burial tumuli, or even to construct burial sort of cyst graves. And it's a quite common practice and dates to the late 4th and 3rd century BC.
Okay.
There's a good publication by Damyanov about that thing. So, yeah, just to
you can share
keep
with
in
me.
mind.
Okay.
My pleasure. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
And as a matter of fact, I have a question for you as well.
Okay.
Talking about the way the skeletons were placed on the ground. At some point, you said extended burial anterior down.
Anterior up.
But there was an anterior down as well. Face down.
No, I have one or two, but it's not from Eastern Symmetry. That's the interior down. The burial come down, all the face down. Okay. And this is from العلمين tomb. I didn't put because also I can't. Sorry, but it's there are positions like interior down. Yes, there are.
Okay, that's
Yes,
really
yes, very interested. Yes.
Any chance you tell us the date of that?
I think
Roman?
no, Roman.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yes.
Recently, we have two skeletons looking to a couple, looking to each other.
Yeah.
Don't tell me it was in Serbia.
Yes.
Who was I? Okay. I will see the photos, please.
You have to come, yes.
Yes, please, sorry. Yeah.
I just want to comment on the problem of the domestic way, the cooking pottery in the tombs and necropolis. In the papyri from Roman Egypt exactly, you find a lot of evidence about Anopeion, which is a festival held in the tomb, where a meal is eaten by the relatives of the family, according to the relatives of the deceased. According to Egyptian norms, it is the annual memory of the burying the deceased. According to the Greek tradition, it could happen in his birth date or the anniversary of his death as well. For you, Nicholas, I have a question, or perhaps better to say dialogue, about the children buried in the houses. Did you reach a conclusion about their age?
Infants.
Very small, recently born?
Sorry?
Are they recently born or very, very young aged?
Yeah, infants. I mean,
It's from 1 year to 3 years, something like that.
Well, I wanted to add something I know for sure, personal I know. Some years ago in the Egyptian Delta at least, when a family has an infant to die in this very early age, it was buried inside the house.
Okay.
I said some years ago.
Wow.
Yes. In the Egyptian Delta at least. I don't know about Upper Egypt.
Okay. When is this? When was this going on?
No.
Like
No, any dig in the any bit in the house.
Okay.
But not in the rooms. Perhaps in the courtyard or near the outer door, perhaps, but not in the rooms.
That's really good to know.
Great.
Yeah, may I remember now that I wanted to ask about the infanticide. You mentioned infanticide in Hellenistic times, which looks something that is not common at that time. But yes, the number you mentioned and the collection of the fetuses and bodies, this needs to be investigated, I think.
Yeah,
why and in what context? I mean, what social context that led to such infanticide?
When it comes to the Athenian bone well, Maria Liston, who studied she's an anthropologist and studied the bones of the children in there, she came to the conclusion that at least one of these kids was a victim of domestic violence in a relatively young age. He or she had a stroke in the head from behind. And yes, he concluded that that was one of the few known victims of domestic violence in antiquity. So, well, the other infants in the well were basically thrown in there while alive or dead. We cannot tell at this stage of research. But there are hints of proper infanticide going on.
You spoke about hundreds.
Yeah, they're dead, but we don't know if they were thrown there while being dead already, or if they were thrown in there while being alive.
So, in relation to yesterday, looking to the finds, to the grave goods in tombs of Hellenistic Greece, I remember you commented in my lecture that the finds of Sadby or other cemeteries like Sadby, that after all are not that modest as I was thinking regarding the financial status of the dead.
No, I said they are modest.
I mean, yes, but it doesn't mean necessarily that the financial status of the dead.
Yeah,
so, of course, there will be always high-end funerary monuments, but what do you think now comparing the average burial, let's say, context of a burial in Alexandria to the Hellenistic Greek mainland? I mean, do you see the average or the bottom end, let's say, to stand a bit higher or lower? How do you see this? Because, for example, I would never expect such individual tombs in Alexandria to happen, because in my mind it's very organized. But how do you see this comparison from place to place?
It has to be very and really distant one, because these comparisons only occur when we compare data from the same cemetery, not from entirely different regions. And yet again, you have to define what wealth, proper wealth, means in Ptolemaic terms, and what wealth means in proper Hellenistic terms. I'm sure in the end it won't be that different, but still, from what I've seen so far in Alexandria, I would say that the general impression I get is that they are not that well furnished, or at least as good as I would have expected them to be. Okay, in proper quantitative terms. I'm not talking about quality here, just numbers. Whereas in Hellenistic Greece, vaguely and broadly defined, I would say that the graves that are being furnished are generally better furnished than, but just that's just a thought from.
You're right, because I think even in Sadby cemetery, individual burials like those under the towers are better furnished than
Kyriako, I have to emphasize though, especially in Greece, I don't know if this sort of distinction occurs in Egypt as well. In northern Greece, central Greece upwards, the graves are much better furnished than the ones, the same grave type of the same date in southern Greece. So
that two parallel things that can be.
Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Now this conclusion consider if the cemetery or the necropolis is systematically abandoned or not.
The cemetery of Sorry,
that this conclusion, the tombs in northern Greece is better furnished than those in the southern part of Greece, as in Alexandria as well. But I wanted to investigate an outer factor, like the systematic excavations of the tomb. Because in Alexandria, I think only Mustafa Kamil was now after the investigation of Dr. Monan Kyriakos in Shadby should be listed on the left side. It was not systematically excavated. So Alexandria had its own condition, but what about Greece?
Yeah. It has to do with many things. Okay, you rightly point out that the key parameter of systematic publication. Okay, otherwise we're just talking about random things here. Inevitably, many more Hellenistic cemeteries are excavated in northern Greece for obvious reasons, rather than in southern Greece. That's one key thing. The other key thing is that the cemeteries in northern Greece are rather extensive and crowded, as opposed to southern mainland Greece. And I say mainland because if you look at islands like Rhodes, you do come across quite extensive and packed up cemeteries there. Taking into account at least these two major parameters, I will insist by saying that the cemeteries in southern Greece are relatively poor as opposed to the contemporary ones in northern Greece, again. Okay. But only in quantitative terms, not quality. I'm not talking about quality.
Look at the Museum of Thessaloniki, full of golden objects. It's in quality as well. No?
Yeah, Professor Plantis.
Yes, I'm sure we all like looking at the gold of the Macedonians. Less burial gifts and less gold doesn't mean poorer graves, and certainly not poorer people. People in the south are more frugal. They want to keep their gold for themselves. Gold they did have, and we know this for periods in Athens, for example. We know that everybody was very rich after the Persian Wars. This wealth does not end up in their graves because they prefer to do other things with it. Yeah, exactly. It's like now in Greece, we're not buried with our gold. We leave it to our offspring. So certainly, people are more like to display or to take their gold with them or whatever in Thessaly, further north. But it's not a question of wealth. It's a question of having the wealth and flaunting it, perhaps. Just this remark. Yeah, I'm the chair here. So, anyone else? Perhaps a remark or a comment or a question? Yeah. All right.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for this such informative presentations. Well, my first question is for Ms. Aya. I would just want to give me a piece of information more about the kind of skeletons that have been found there. I needed to know if they were a kind of Caucasian or Negroes, especially that you are speaking about a kind of cosmopolitan city. Right. So why not to figure out the kind of skeletons you are mentioning, okay. Especially that there are different ethnics, and it can give a very good and important significance for the site.
Yeah, of course. At beginning, I am study only human remains in the site. I'm not have this experience to know exactly what the things, but maybe after, because I training to know more about the things and different, because it's very important to know if there are from out Egypt, from where they come, maybe, but exactly. This is after. I'm sorry, I can't reply to your question now, but I promise you maybe after I have a publication about this. Thank you.
Inshallah.
DNA, yes, of course. But also there are a characterize of for the skull, for example, and also
Yes.
some treatment in the skull and also the bust.
And the eyes
cranium.
and the jaws,
Yes,
the upper
they
jaws
talk-
in the
yeah,
Negroes
yeah,
are
of
also
course.
protruded,
Yes.
and the eye and the
Yeah.
eyeball is bigger. So there are
I,
some characteristics that you can figure
yes,
out.
I was training 2018 was a metropolitan mission, and we have like a sheet for a trait of skeleton. So we record all the trait from the cranium and also postcranium body. And the woman there is called Chris Marshall. She tried to make like to know the characterize of population of Egyptian people. So she will collect all these in database, and after we can know more about people who burned in this site. So I will make this, but after, not now. I will make this. Thank you for it.
Inshallah.
Perhaps the very last one. Anyone? If not, so.
Bye bye. So bye bye.
So thank you once again for being with us tonight.